Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a massive, frankly bombshell report that alleges a decades-long espionage and influence operation right here inside the United States, all orchestrated by the Cuban government. So we're going to break down these claims, look at the history, and unpack what intelligence experts are saying about the whole shebang.
70 years. Now, according to a brand new report released by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that is exactly how long the Cuban regime has supposedly been running what they call an invisible invasion of America. For 7 decades, the report claims, Havana has been pulling the strings on one of the most sophisticated espionage operations on the planet, literally right under our noses.
To wrap our heads around all this, we're going to hit 4 main points today. The Rubio report itself, the history of this invisible invasion, how it ties into shifting American politics, and finally, what this means for global democratic trends.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Rubio report, which officially labels Cuba as the capital of 21st century communism. The sheer scale of the allegations here is just wild. We're talking way beyond your standard spycraft. The report alleges Havana actually penetrated the absolute deepest levels of U.S. security. We're talking the State Department, Homeland Security, and the Pentagon. But it doesn't stop there. It claims that while operating in the shadows all those years, these networks actively helped revolutionaries and terrorists, and played a huge role in mainstreaming Marxist ideologies across everyday American society.
So that brings us to Section 2, an invisible invasion. To back up these massive claims, the report, along with insights from former CIA analyst Martin Gurri, lays out the historical scope of this network. 2,500. You see, this isn't just about spreading ideas, it's about actual, physical actions. The report claims Cuba helped fund a terror pipeline responsible for over 2,500 bombings in the 1970s alone, all while recruiting thousands of activists. It really paints a picture of a heavily funded machine designed to destabilize the country from the inside out.
If you look at the timeline, it's just a constant continuum. You've got those 1970s bombings, and then you have guys like Kendall Myers. Myers spent roughly 50 years, half a century, as a senior U.S. official, eventually becoming an ambassador, while secretly working for Havana the whole time. And then fast forward to today, the analysis points to sitting politicians who are allegedly linked to the hardcore Marxist Venceremos brigades.
To kind of put this into perspective, Martin Gurri shares this crazy story. He actually remembers sitting at a table with Kendall Myers at the State Department years ago. Myers was giving this speech, openly mourning the fall of the Soviet Union, saying what a tragedy it was. Gurri remembers just shaking his head at the time. It wasn't until a whole decade later that he found out the guy sitting across from him was an active Cuban spy. It just goes to show the massive blind spots U.S. intelligence allegedly had back then.
Gurri also notes how this influence trickled right down into local politics. He specifically names 2 Los Angeles mayors, including Karen Bass, as former participants in those Venceremos brigades. He calls these brigades hardcore, basically functioning as total revolutionary propaganda machines. But somehow, people associated with them rose to top political spots in major American cities, which is wild because it shows how international networks allegedly planted roots in our local governance.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, shifting American politics. Because you really have to wonder, if these folks had such deep, radical red flags, how on earth did they navigate the American political system to get elected?
Well, Gurri doesn't mince words here. He says, quote, "They are where they are because people wanted them to be there and voted for them." Basically, he's arguing that, sure, the Cubans might have nudged things along, but the American left didn't need Cuba to be crazy. At the end of the day, voters looked at candidates with these anti-system backgrounds and said, yep, that's exactly who we want in charge.
So, why did voters do that? Gurri points to a massive structural collapse. He argues that traditional political establishments on both sides have essentially cratered. Just like the Republican establishment was upended by the MAGA movement about 12 years ago, he sees the exact same thing happening on the left. He calls the old Democratic establishment crusty and fossilized, which basically left the door wide open for socialists to swoop in looking like exciting anti-establishment alternatives. And this collapse of the center, it totally changed the game. Gurri suggests it allowed groups like the DSA to gain a ton of influence and normalize what he calls third world rhetoric, basically blaming the West, the US, and Israel for everything wrong in the world. You even see it in policy now, like politician Zoran Mamandi pitching government-owned stores for artificially cheap goods, which Gurri just flat out calls a constructed fantasy world. And the engine driving all this?
Guri says it's intense anti-Trump sentiment, making voters way more willing to back radical candidates just to push back against the right.
But hey, this is not just happening here. Let's look at Section 4, Global Democratic Trends, and see how this ties into a pretty alarming pattern worldwide.
Take a look at Nicaragua. Dictator Daniel Ortega recently got back into power, and you know what his first move was? He just boldly announced they're not holding elections anymore. Done. It's authoritarianism 101. But the source material points out that American politicians like Bernie Sanders have actually praised Ortega in the past, seemingly just because Ortega opposes the U.S. It really shows how being anti-Western can sometimes blind politicians to actual foreign dictatorships.
Guri calls this global pattern democratic backsliding. His theory is that democracy is becoming conditional. It's like there's a good side and an evil side, and the democratic process is only respected if the quote-unquote right side wins. If the establishment thinks the wrong side won, well, the process gets bypassed or just outright canceled.
And if you think that's only happening in Latin America, look at Europe. Guri points straight to Romania as a prime example. He notes that elections there were literally canceled because populist candidates, who the establishment viewed as the wrong side, actually won. Instead of accepting the voters' choice, the system just pulled the plug on the election.
So, we've covered a lot today, from a 70-year Cuban spy network allegedly burrowing into U.S. agencies to the implosion of the American political center, right down to elections being canceled overseas. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to chew on. As these traditional, moderate establishments keep collapsing all over the world, just how resilient are our democracies against invisible foreign influence and extreme domestic polarization? Are our institutions strong enough to handle all this outside pressure when they're fracturing so badly on the inside? It's something we're all going to have to figure out. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what you see.